Just getting it, hang on. Alrighty. Okay, welcome. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Sessions with Sefi as the dust settles. Tonight, we're lucky enough to have with us Sefi Shalam, who is the Shaliach for Netzer and the progressive community. And we're going to be discussing all things Israel election, coalition building, and expectations for the Israeli government moving forward. You'll notice that we don't just have Sefi with us. We're also lucky enough to have Ben Krazer. Ben is a madrich at Netzer, and he has put his hand up to join the discussion tonight. So we thank Ben for taking the time. And because of this, I'm actually going to take a bit of a step back and let Ben and Sefi to discuss all things Israel election. As always, none of this would be possible without the continued generosity of our supporters, so we thank them for that. And if anyone has any questions for Sefi throughout the presentation, please don't hesitate to post them in the comments section of the video. With that said, I'm going to hand it over to Sefi and Ben, and thanks everyone for tuning in and enjoy.
Hi everyone. Thanks, Joey. Firstly, I'd like to thank Temple Bet Israel for letting us use this space so we can be here and talk to you about everything Israel, really. And I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land, the Woi Wurrung and Boon Wurrung people. We realize that the land was never ceded, and we offer our respects to their elders, past, present, and future. So, Sefi, before we get into a few questions, do you want to discuss the current climate in Israel and what's happened in the last few weeks?
Sure. Erev Tov, good evening. What I think we can start with is discussing the last few months of how did we get to where we are now. So I arrived in Melbourne in April 2019. Actually, I left Israel right after voting on the first round of elections. And I thought, that's it, 4 years of no voting, exactly the time I was supposed to be on Shlichut, perfect. And of course, it didn't happen. And we had 3 rounds of elections, and we kept running into a deadlock where none of the political blocs was able to maintain 61 members of the Knesset, which is just the minimal majority you need in order to build the coalition. And then we had the third elections in, what was it, March. And we saw the results, and we said, there we are again. Same deadlock. The right-wing bloc plus Haredim had, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, had 58 seats. The central left plus Arabs, or central left plus Israel Beitenu of Lieberman still didn't have the majority. It was pretty clear that it's not going to work as a minority government for Gantz. And it looked like we're going to 4th elections, and then came the corona and possibly saved us. We say in Hebrew, it gave them a ladder to climb down from the very tall tree they all stood on. And then the president, Rivlin, again called for unity government, and Netanyahu and Gantz decided to go for it and to build the unity government. Last time it happened was with Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Shamir in the late 80s, between the Labour Party and the Likud. And then they decided to basically build it. Now, the way it works is a rotation. Someone starts as prime minister, then passes it on to the second person. Gantz listened to what all of the advisors solicited and non-solicited advice that he received. Never trust Netanyahu. Netanyahu never keeps his promise. Don't trust his word for letting you become the prime minister later on. And Netanyahu didn't invent it. Shimon Peres, the last time we had a unity government, before he became loved by almost everyone, Shimon Peres was possibly the dirtiest politician we had in Israel. And just before he was supposed to clear his seat as prime minister and give it to Yitzhak Shamir, he tried to pull off a trick that would allow him to continue for 2 minutes. So Gantz sealed it all together. Many laws in Israel were changed. and the agreement was made that Bibi will be prime minister for 18 months, then he passes it on to Gantz, but they were both sworn in at the same time about 2 weeks ago as prime minister and substitute prime minister, which is Gantz's role now. The coalition is built of the Likud, the Haredi parties, blue and white of Benny Gantz, and what's left of the Labour Party, which is not much. And it was split evenly, the seats and everything was split entirely evenly between the Likud and blue and white, when both of them get veto power on major issues. So for example, now that there needs to be a new chief prosecutor appointed, both of them have the veto power or deciding who it would be. So that's where we stand now. Now, obviously, in order to do that, Gantz had to do something that he promised not to do. To say that countless times he promised not to sit in a government under Benjamin Netanyahu will be the understatement of the year. It's literally countless times. You genuinely cannot count the amount of times when Benny Gantz, in 1 year, promised to never sit in one government under Benjamin Netanyahu. And then he just did it. And then you can speak about the huge amount of the ministers. We have 34 ministers, including Dudi Amsalem, who is now the Minister for Higher Education and Water. True, that's his ministry. He now asked to appoint 2 Director Generals to the Water Ministry. Not 1, because 1 is not enough. So there is huge criticism over that. There is huge criticism over anything you can imagine, but yet the vast majority of Israelis think that this solution was better than the alternative, which was 4th elections.
Fair enough. That makes sense. Now, we're going to go into some questions. So obviously, people watching live, you can also send in questions through the comment section of the Facebook live video. But I have some questions that you guys have sent in prior, and we're going to start with those. All anonymous, don't worry if you don't want your name to be said. That is easily done. We'll start with the first one. Many see Netanyahu's victory as not driven by ideology, but as one signaling a profound shift to the right. Meretz seems to be the only left-wing party left in Israel. What does this say about the left-wing movement and their policies and even their appeal in Israel?
So actually, whoever sent this question, it's a very good one, very accurate analysis, I think, of the reality. So first of all, the elections in Israel were in many ways on the last round between 2 blocks. One block was the Bibi block, that the members of this block literally had to sign their a promise to go with Netanyahu almost no matter what. The second block was the anything but Bibi block, led by Benny Gantz back then in the days when he opposed Netanyahu. And the anything but Bibi block was a bit artificial because it was built from the Arab parties, which is one joint list that received 16 seats in the current Knesset. So the biggest achievement they've ever had. But you have to remember they're actually comprised of 4 different parties. We see one list, but this list has Hadash, which is kind of the socialist party. Socialist, obviously secular, mostly educated. With them on the same party, we have the Islamic movement. So we have to remember it's very different. And then it had the Labour Party that joined forces with Meretz and with Orly Levy, that the first thing she did after the elections was to leave this party and join the right-wing bloc. and with blue and white, that's also comprised of 3 different parties, and Lieberman, which is on some issues, I say, very left-wing. If you look at issues regarding his stated opinion, not what he voted in the Knesset, his stated opinions about matters of religion and state, for example, very left-wing. Maybe Meretz are more left-wing than him on that. And if you look on other issues, he openly opposes the Palestinian state, so very right-wing. So this entire bloc was built around anything but Bibi. And whoever asked this question, you were very accurate in the fact that many people who voted for Bibi said, I absolutely despise the fact that this is the leader of this bloc, but he's much better than the alternative of having a more left-wing government. Some people love Bibi and think that he's the best thing that has ever happened to Israel. So we have all of them. Now, about what currently happens, in my previous presentation in Bet Weizmann before the corona started, just before the elections, I spoke about the Labour Party and said, don't be surprised if they're going to completely disappear off the map. And they didn't disappear off the map, but currently they have only 3 members in the Knesset. You have to remember it's a party that in their glory days they had 45. Just 5 years ago they had 24. So they have only 3 members in the Knesset. One of them, Mirav Michaeli, said that because they decided to join the government led by Bibi, she will officially remain a member of Knesset on behalf of the Labour Party, but practically stop working with them. And that leaves us Meretz and the 3 members as pretty much the only Zionists left, which is tiny. If you remember the days of, in the 90s, for example, Rabin's government in the 90s, the left wing was huge. I think something around 12 members for Meretz and 30 something for the Labour. And a few other central parties. Currently it's tiny, but speaking about the left is not only the Zionist left. I view Hadash, for example, the socialist or social democrat part of the Arab party, as also a part of the left. They're just not Zionist. But if you look at matters of employment, for example, or matters of state and religion, again, in all of those, there is not much difference between them and Meretz. So yes, the Israeli left is tiny at the moment. I think it's a part of a global trend. Like in the 80s, we saw that the left is getting smaller and smaller, but we were never that small in Israel. If you look at the future, and you want to be optimistic or pessimistic, depends on which side of the political map you are. First of all, the right-wing parties, the people voting for them tend to have much more kids. Second, if you look at the trends with teenagers in Israel are much more right-wing even compared to the adults. So what's the future holds for us is probably going even more to the right.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think I can say also that as a member of the youth, that not just in Australia, like there is like a lot of a big shift to the right as well in other countries. And like as much as I would personally like to see a little bit of a shift towards the center, but like it depends on what we want and what we teach ourselves and what we value. But we'll go to the next question, which is how much of an influence will smaller parties have in this new coalition?
So inside the coalition, the influence of small parties is enormous. The small parties we have to mention are, or we can call it sections or CA, which is, I don't know how to translate to English, fraction, I think. The factions are, so we have the big parties, which is the Likud and blue and white. Blue and White has 17 members at the moment, or actually 15 members. 12 of them are ministers. The Likud has 33 members. I think something around 10 of them are only ministers. So the government is officially built of two blocks, the Likud's block and Blue and White's block. The Likud's block also includes the Haredi parties. So Shas got two ministries. The Yahadut Torah, United Torah Judaism got one ministry, but also the financial committee of the Knesset, which is much stronger than many ministries. So they knew what they're aiming for. So they got pretty strong power compared to their size. And then we have Orly Levy, who deserted again from the United Zionist Left party and moved to the right-wing bloc. She became a minister and invented ministry, by the way. They invented a ministry just for her. Then we have Rabbi Rafi Peretz, who deserted from the Jewish Home, or Yamina as it's now called, practically the modern Orthodox. So he deserted from them and he became a minister. So we have already two people who are a fraction of their own and got to be ministers. We have the Labour Party, only two people in the coalition, both of them are ministers. And we have another fraction that wasn't supposed to be with Benny Gantz. They were part of Blue and White in the election, but weren't supposed to go with Benny Gantz. And another person who deserted from Yair Lapid's party. All three of them got to be ministers. So this government, really, if you joined the coalition, you got to be a minister, which is pretty insane. Think of Australia, of an independent. Not every independent joining the coalition will become a minister. So the power of small parties is enormous today in Israel, despite the fact that the Likud, Blue and White, maybe together with the Haredim, could have formed the government themselves. They didn't need anyone else, but they chose to bring in some others, maybe believing that somewhere along the road they will split.
Yeah, and accommodate more opinions, but also creates more of a filtration for what can and can't go in, which in my opinion is a shift in the right direction. This is a big question, I'll definitely say. As simply as you can, Sefi, why is Bibi Netanyahu not in jail?
Easy one.
Easy.
Okay, so I'll use that to pivot towards Netanyahu's criminal proceedings in the court that started 10 days ago. So what happened is that, as all of you obviously know, Netanyahu has 3 criminal cases against him. To make it easier for us, we have case 1,000, 2,000, and 4,000. 3,000 was dropped along the way, and it was decided that Netanyahu will not be prosecuted on it. And then the official court hearings were supposed to start on March 17th. Because of the coronavirus, they were delayed and started last Sunday, so 10 days ago. And basically, he faces 3 cases. The heaviest of them is where he is officially accused of receiving bribe, not in money, but in favorable media coverage, which is worth a lot of money when you think about it. And what the chief prosecutor says is that he did it in very clear give and take relations. 2 other cases, he has minor allegations, but each one of them can send him to prison for 3 years, each one of them alone. So altogether, we're looking at possibly 12 years in prison for Netanyahu. How can he form a government? That's the main question. So before the coalition, before the elections, and right after the elections, many organizations went to the Supreme Court and told them, listen, it cannot be that you will be even allowed to form a government. And the Supreme Court said, hold your horses, we're not dealing with theoretical questions here. We'll deal with it when the time comes. And when he actually wants to form a government, that's when we'll give you our answer. And then the time came, and they went to the Supreme Court. And the law in Israel is very clear. You cannot serve as a minister while there are criminal proceedings against you in the court. You cannot serve as as minister. You can serve as an MK, as a member of the Knesset, and you can serve as a prime minister while there are criminal proceedings against you in the court. And now what you will say, okay, but the people who wrote the law never imagined that we'll get to the point where someone will have criminal cases while he's forming the government. Well, actually, the truth is different. The Supreme Court went and received from Netanyahu's lawyers the protocols of the discussions in the Knesset before the law was written, before the law was passed, allowing the prime minister to serve with criminal proceedings against him. And they said specifically in the meeting, but what if there are serious allegations against him while he wants to become prime minister? And they still wrote the law, despite of that. So this argument failed entirely in the court. And then what Netanyahu's lawyers said, and the court actually accepted it, was the people voted for him. Way over 1 million people voted for the Likud, headed by Netanyahu, as a person with serious criminal offenses against him. If you include the right-wing bloc, that the leaders of this bloc said very clearly we're going to support Netanyahu, over 2 million Israelis very consciously went and voted for parties that said that Netanyahu will be our prime minister. And the court said, take the law, take the logic behind the law that existed, take the people's will, and if you're talking about serving the democracy, telling him that he cannot be the prime minister isn't serving the democracy, it's undermining the democracy. It's undermining what the people wanted, and it's undermining what the people who wrote the law meant. And they said it's clearly not our role to say that he cannot do it. Now, what needs to happen for this person to get what they want and for Netanyahu to go to jail? Oh, July is the next hearing in Netanyahu's criminal offenses. He will not go to court on that day. The court decided that he doesn't have to come. His lawyers can represent him. Then, if you look at past cases, there are 330 witnesses in one of the cases, and a few more on the others. Some of them will take just 20, 30 minutes, but some of them will take a few days. If we're looking at an average criminal court hearings in Israel happening 3 times a week, minus the holidays, minus a few weeks a year when the court is on leave, we're looking at about 2 years until we'll have a verdict. When those 2 years end, first of all, Netanyahu will not be prime minister anymore. It will be Benny Gantz in November 21. But when those 2 years are over, even if he is convicted, the law clearly says that he can continue serving until we finished with the Supreme Court appeals. So the earliest of the earliest when this will be behind us, either Netanyahu is convicted or cleared of all charges, is sometime in mid-2023, being optimistic.
And if they convict him, and even if Gantz is prime minister at the time, that they go into a 4th election as well, correct?
We're supposed to go into elections 3 years from now.
3 years.
So
from now.
a part of the coalition agreements was to temporarily change the law. So we'll go to elections in 3 years instead of 4.5.
Lovely, lovely. Another election for Israel. The next question is, how will the Israel judiciary be able to maintain its independence?
Okay, so I'll give the background to this question. The Israel judiciary has been under severe attacks by the right-wing parties. Some of them, all of them come from the place where they say that it's too active. Behind the scenes, they say it's too left-wing, and the judges lean to the left. Again, the same judges that are accused to lean to the left are the ones that allowed Netanyahu to serve as prime minister. But that's the accusations made. And then the previous Minister of Justice, Ayelet Shaked, from then Habayit HaYehudi, again the modern Orthodox party, went full force against the Supreme Court and against the chief prosecutor to limit their strength within the system. She did it in a moderate way. So she did things that you can say that you disagree with her, but it was within the rules of the political and judicial game. Then, I think it was between the first and second elections, both her and Naftali Bennett from her party, who was then the Minister of Education, they split from the Jewish Home to a different party. And because of that, Netanyahu decided to sack them from their roles as ministers. And Ayelet Shaked, her role, he gave to a backbench, a member of the Knesset, Amir Ohana, who was always known as very loyal and close to Netanyahu. And Amir Ohana, with him, all hell broke loose for the judicial system. He went and imagine a Minister of Justice who clearly attacks on every interview, says that the Supreme Court is terrible and that the Attorney General is terrible, and that there should be criminal investigations against the Attorney General, and that the chief prosecutor should be sacked, and if you could have done it, you would have done it. Insane what Amir Ohana did, in the level that people within the Likud said, come on, it's too much. It's too much what you're doing. And then for the question, now I get to actually answer the question. For answering the question of what will save the judicial system in Israel is the current minister. So Blue and White in the negotiation said, no matter what, we demand to receive two ministries. One is the Minister of Justice. The second is the Ministry of Communication, because they believe that those two, together with the Ministry of Culture and Sport, which they received eventually, was what they called the democracy package. Those are the three ministers that are the most crucial in order to save the Israeli democracy. The current Minister of Justice, Nissan Cohen, Avi Nissan Cohen, was he went immediately from the moment he went into his office and said, we're here to save the system. And over my dead body, that people will attack the system as they want to do it. And that brought a lot of hope for the more moderate people. Important to mention that what the right wing did now wasn't their invention. When Kadima under Ehud Olmert ruled, there was Daniel Friedman, who was a professor of law, who was appointed Minister of Justice, and he also tried to minimize the role of the Attorney General, to limit the judicial liberty of the Supreme Court. He also tried, he completely failed. Ayelet Shaked minorly failed, Amir Ohana himself said that he didn't succeed in doing what he tried to do.
I'll actually get on to, this is a question that I really want to know the answer to, which is what do these results and the unity government mean for Arab Israelis?
So for a second, it was seen like we're going to a bright future for Arab Israelis, Palestinian citizens of Israel, two names that practically mean the same people. The future looked very promising for them. After the last two elections, so what happens after the election is that the president calls the leaders of all the parties to ask, who do you recommend as the next prime minister? And then the person who receives the most recommendations gets to try and form the coalition. The Arab parties twice said that they want Benny Gantz to be the prime minister. And that was the first time in Israeli history when Arab parties recommended a non-Arab member of Knesset as the prime minister. And that was a part of a deal when Gantz said that he will change the Israeli nationality law or the nation-state law, sorry, and he said that he will really help the Arab society. And it looked like for a moment, like it might actually be feasible that Gantz will be able to form a coalition without Netanyahu and with a lot of support from external support from the Arab parties. And in exchange, it will give them a lot of support to what they want to promote. Bottom line, we all know it didn't happen. So the promises by Gantz are still there. Important to say that Netanyahu's government did come up a few years ago with a 5-year plan to really make a difference for the Arab society. Some bits of it actually happened and made a very big impact on the Arab society. Some bits of it never actually happened, but it was Netanyahu's government who promoted it. Allegedly, there is supposed to be better support for the Arabs in Israel, especially when we speak about everyone who speaks about one-state solution cannot work on this one state without strengthening the Arabs who already live in Israel. They're the basis for the entire story. If you're speaking about two states, ironically enough, the Arabs who live in Israel, the Arab citizens of Israel are much less critical for the solution. But for a one-state solution, they're amazingly critical. So I don't necessarily think that the fact that we still have a pretty right-wing government means bad news for the Arabs. I think you might be surprised, although for a while we always had the governments that had at least an Arab or a Druze member in them, and now we have zero. Not a single member of the coalition is neither Arab nor Druze.
Yeah, I remember in Israel learning about a few Arab and Bedouin like members of Israel who vote for Shas as well because they because of the taxes and they don't give them tax, so why not vote for them?
They have the same. It actually almost doesn't happen anymore, but they have the same reasons to succeed because they have a lot of kids. So anything Shas does for families that have many kids is good for them as well. Yeah. And they don't usually one member of the household, either the man or the woman, doesn't work. Same goes with Shas. If you give benefits to households where only one person works,
goes both ways.
Goes both ways. It's good for them as well. So generally, many of them voted for Shas, knowing that it's good for them.
Yeah. We'll move on to the next question, which is so after 18 months with Bibi, and he has to hand over the reins to the other Benjamin, in Benny Gantz. Do you think the transition from Prime Minister to Prime Minister will be peaceful?
Yes, I'll tell you why. First of all, because I'm optimistic, and I tend to believe in the goodness of people, even if they've proven otherwise in the past. But also, what Gantz built there is a fortress around this transition, which will be amazingly difficult to harm. For example, one section of the agreement between the Likud and Blue and White says that at any point, if the Knesset calls for new elections, currently, immediately we go for new elections, within 3 months, more or less. What they changed temporarily is that if the Knesset calls for new elections, we hold our horses. Benny Gantz steps into the Prime Minister's office for 6 months, and only then we go to election. So no matter what happens, unless Gantz agrees to that, he will be the Prime Minister in the next elections. And so he really fortified himself from anything you can and cannot imagine. Actually, the person who advised him on that, who actually wrote the agreement, was the Deputy Attorney General, the former Deputy Attorney General, who is one of the biggest experts in Israel for constitutional law. And he's the one who wrote the agreement between them as an agreement that cannot be broken.
Hopefully. We'll move on to the next one, which is actually kind of it's a bit of an intro, and then it's kind of 2 questions in one, but we'll go through it all. Did Trump and Netanyahu's relatively positive relationship, definitely in quotation marks, give Bibi the leg up in this election? What is your opinion on the decision of Benny Gantz to abandon many of the secular values of Blue and White to join the coalition of Netanyahu and himself?
So, it's 2 questions.
Yeah.
Netanyahu, when I was still in Israel last year, before the first round of elections, you could see huge ads, huge billboards on Netanyahu. You were in Israel as well. So what most of the billboards said for a while were pictures of Netanyahu and foreign leaders, Putin, Trump, etc. And they said, Netanyahu, a different league, or a league of his own. And basically what they tried to portray was...
Sorry about that.
What they tried to portray was Netanyahu has great relations with Trump, Netanyahu has great relations with Putin, Netanyahu has great relations with many other foreign leaders, therefore he's the right person for us. So many people definitely, I can tell you many members of my family who said it very clearly, that you could see that when it comes to foreign relations, he's a league of his own. I'll just say, under Netanyahu, the Israeli Foreign Ministry is currently at the biggest crisis it has ever had, both financially and in other purposes. I won't go much deeper than that, but some will completely disagree with this. But specifically about his relations with Trump and the benefits it can give to Israel, there was no doubt that the fact that Trump and Netanyahu are almost similar in many things really helped Bibi be elected. And the second question was about Blue and White abandoning the secular lines. 100% true, I think. Bottom line, they went into a government, with the Haredi parties that has always vetoed anything which is not really good for them in terms of religion and state. So if Gantz very clearly promised to promote public transport on Shabbat. I cannot see it happening in this shift. If Gantz very clearly promised to promote civil marriage, or at least civil marriage, so there are about 400,000 people living in Israel who are officially people who have no religion. Mostly people who came from the former Soviet Union, made Aliyah. For some reason, they were allowed to make Aliyah. For example, if your paternal grandfather was Jewish, by the Orthodox halacha, you're in no way Jewish. We're sitting at Temple Beit Israel, obviously here. It's a different case, but I'm speaking about the Orthodox halacha that rules Israel. You're not Jewish, but you are allowed to make Aliyah as Jewish. So officially in Israel, you're considered as your nationality is Jewish, but not your religion. So we have about 400,000 of those who just cannot get married in Israel. There's no legal way for them to get married in Israel. Gantz promised to change the law. I'll be blown off my feet, if you will. So yeah, you can add that to the list of the promises that Gantz broke when he went in the coalition with Netanyahu. I'll give you the answer that him and his members of his party keep saying. Yes, we broke some promises, still it's much better than the alternative, the fourth election.
Yeah, that is definitely the idea. I can tell you from my relative standpoint that there was like each time the next election came around when I was in Israel, and my relatives were like, not another one, just not another one. And it just kept going and going. And I can say from like my family has a range of different like political like spectrums from the left all the way to the far right. And I can say personally from my the left-wing side of my family that they got very, very sick of what was happening, and they kept saying that the agendas behind each politician were becoming thinner and thinner until it was a much more personalized election than.
Definitely, the biggest loser of the elections is the people's trust in the political system. People's trust in Israel currently in politicians and in the political system is non-existent. Like generally, I don't know how can you even create a campaign, how can blue and white in the next elections create a political campaign where they promise something? By the way, same for Netanyahu, because Nir Barkat, who used to be the mayor of Jerusalem and left his position in order to join the Likud, right before the elections, Netanyahu stood in a press conference with Nir Barkat and said, mark my words, when I'm prime minister again, he will be the treasurer. Nir Barkat is currently not only not the treasurer, he's a simple MK. So it's not only Benny Gantz who promises here.
We'll go to the next question. I'll let you guys know that you can also like post stuff to the live feed. That is what the notifications are, sorry. Do you believe that Rivlin could have done more to stop multiple elections? Was the role of president made pointless by Netanyahu's move to disband the Knesset?
So I'll just explain that after the first elections, as I said, the president calls for the leaders of the different parties to recommend who should be the prime minister. Netanyahu was called first. He had 60 people recommending him. He was invited first to form a government, failed, and then what the law says is that he needs to return the mandate to the president, who would have given it to Benny Gantz. Netanyahu decided instead of doing that, I'll just call for new elections. And the Knesset at any given point can decide that we're going to new elections. And that's what the Knesset did, and then Gantz didn't get to the mandate. That's what Bibi did on the first election. On the second, he didn't do it already. The mandate went to Gantz, who failed himself. I generally don't think that Rivlin had anything in his power to do it, because the law is very, very clear on what can the president do in order at this situation, which is simply to decide who gets the mandate. The most he can do is play a bit like he did this time, when after Gantz failed to form a coalition, he didn't give the mandate to Netanyahu. He gave the mandate to the Knesset for 2 weeks and said, the Knesset any member of the Knesset who gets 61 signatories can form a government. And that's what happened. I genuinely don't think that Rivlin could do anything more than what he already did. He was the one who suggested the unity government. He was the one that suggested the 18 months rotation. He was even the one that suggested the person who ended up writing the agreement. So he did do a lot.
Before I get into one of the questions that's sent in to me, I was going to ask one of my questions, sorry, which is mainly about Lieberman. So I can say from the first and second election that, like, if you look at the blocks, the 2 blocks, and how it was set up, and then the line in the middle where they need to pass 60, need to get 61, and in each of the diagrams I saw for the first, second, and third election, there's always the little block of Israel Beitenu that's there overlapping each one, because, well, he didn't choose a side. And now, well, like they discussed with him, obviously, like both parties definitely discussed with him ways to pull him both ways, but he didn't budge. And I wanted to ask that, so this unity government is basically like a bit of like a destroyed what Lieberman, it kind of levied his power over the situation a little bit. So yeah. What does it really mean for him?
So in the second and third elections, you're right. Lieberman and his party Israel Beitenu was a block of their own. On the first elections, in the media, they were considered as part of the right-wing bloc. No one expected him to just leave Netanyahu. My guess, something personal happened there between Netanyahu and Lieberman. They were really close at the first go of Netanyahu as prime minister. They were amazingly close. Netanyahu was the one who actually brought Lieberman into the Israeli politics. And then there was a huge division all of a sudden. Some people say it's because Sarah Netanyahu can't stand Lieberman. But they were always political allies. Lieberman was the second longest serving Minister of Foreign Affairs in Israel's history under Netanyahu. He was the Minister of Defense under Netanyahu. Sometimes they would argue, and then he would still come back to the warm hug of Netanyahu. And then it was known that no one can form a government without Lieberman, and then, as you said, they went to a unity government, and Lieberman is needless. And no one needs him all of a sudden. Bottom line, at the moment, he's just a guy shouting from the opposition, which is not the position where he can actually do much. Yeah. In the long term, you can never tell. Everyone knows that Lieberman's long-term plan is to somehow go back to the Likud after Netanyahu leaves and become prime minister. For a moment, it looked as if he's serious enough to be able to do it. And now it absolutely doesn't look like the case. But Lieberman, don't forget, people said that that's the end of his political career 2 years ago. So never say never when it comes to Lieberman.
Only time will tell.
And I don't rule out the chances of him joining this coalition just yet.
100%. We'll move on to the next question, which is a bit shifting away from the election, well, more about the election, but more about the United States. So the relationship between US and other diaspora Jews in Israel is like sour, taking into consideration the progressive swing within Jewish communities around the world in comparison to Israel. Yeah, where you've indicated that many young people swing to the right. Yes, I did say that as well, and you said that as well. So, how does that relationship work in comparison from the diaspora and Israel together?
So I think the diaspora Jews are very different when it comes to political stance. Here in Australia, I didn't invent it. You guys are relatively right-wing. In France, relatively right-wing. Definitely in the former Soviet Union. Many in Germany who come from the former Soviet Union are relatively right-wing. In Brazil, for example, the central left mostly. In the US, it's very clear about 90% of the Jews in the US lean towards the Democrats, if not voting Democrats. And there is a huge gap. And we can see it when young Jews, support Israel less and less. What we have here in Australia is a unique case where the research Gen 17 showed that actually young Jews support Israel more than their parents. So that is a very big question. Actually, you and I sat right here in this room in a meeting with Rabbi David Satterstein, who is arguably one of the most influential Jewish leaders in the world. And we asked him exactly about that. And he said, in our relationship with the Israeli government, whenever we feel, I'm paraphrasing, but whenever we feel that the Israeli government takes it to the extreme too much, we make sure to use our political power and to remind them what is our position. And I think that's a key element. Israel in general, I can tell you, I didn't understand what's the power of the diaspora Jews until I arrived here. And I was involved in politics in this way or another, and I worked at the American Embassy for 3 years, and I knew a lot about this topic. I never understood it fully until I got here, what it actually means. In Israel's perspective, when they speak about the reforms in America, they say, okay, those guys will have women for a rabbi, but they still continue to support us politically, so it's not the end of the world. And what happens if they stop supporting us? Not that much. Obviously, that's not the case. But you have to understand that the vast majority in Israel doesn't really care about it. And someone who deeply understands it, for example, is actually Naftali Bennett, who is on the right wing. He very clearly understands it, and he very clearly understands the fact that while he is clearly modern Orthodox, but clearly Orthodox in Israel, he understands that in the US, for example, the game is different. And that if he doesn't care about what the reforms say in the US, nothing good will happen to the US-Israeli relations in this sense. Despite the fact, by the way, the majority of the people around Trump, the Jews around Trump, the vast majority of them are Orthodox. So Jared Kushner is Orthodox, his daughter, Kushner's wife, Ivanka, her conversion to Judaism was Orthodox. Jason Greenblatt was his advisor, Orthodox. David Friedman, the current ambassador in Israel, who is, I know for a fact, that he's the most influential people when it comes to Israel-US relations. Trump does almost everything Friedman tells him that he thinks should happen. He's Orthodox, came from a Reformed family, but he himself is Orthodox. but still they know their base and they know that they will be in deep trouble if they don't deal with it. And just last word about it, I work obviously for the Jewish Agency, and they're my employer. So my boss is Bougie Herzog, that you could watch last Sunday on the ZFA lockdown learning. And Bougie Herzog was elected as chairperson of the Jewish Agency in spite of what Netanyahu wanted to happen. Netanyahu had other candidates, and it felt as if he was elected in order to tell Netanyahu, hey, we're the ones calling the shots in the Jewish Agency, not you. We will choose someone that you don't necessarily like, one of your biggest political rivals, because we can.
When it's the Jewish Agency, it takes into account more than just Israel in that matter.
Yeah.
So.
But Netanyahu, the day after, Netanyahu boycotted two very important meetings with the Jewish Agency.
Fair enough. He knows how to hold a grudge, I can say. But I'll also add in terms of like diaspora Jews in Australia, there are like 130,000, and that includes 60 to 70,000 in Victoria and New South Wales, with about about 20,000 sitting in around South Australia, Western Australia, and Queensland. And I will say that,
and 100 in the ACT.
And 100 in ACT, yeah. And I've heard there's a few Reform Jews, less modern Orthodox in Tasmania as well. But I will say that over 75%, I think it's actually like 79, like closing in on 80% modern Orthodox, and 85% of those Jews marry each other. So the way in which the Jewish diaspora, the Australian diaspora of Jews feeds down is modern Orthodox people. And like I can say, as a member of Netzer, a progressive Jewish movement, that while it's a very, very, very we're very spread thin in terms of yes, we have our organization is in Perth, Adelaide, Canberra, New South Wales, as well as us, but the bulk of the progressive Judaism falls in the United States, and the United States relationship with Israel and us kind of it falls out differently because of the way it stems, their political shift is further left than Israel and Australia, personally. But I was going to ask, in terms of while we're on the topic of the United States, which is Trump's deal. So Trump's deal of the century that he discussed with Bibi Netanyahu. Does the unity government have any effect on the way this deal is talked about, the way it's even possibly implemented, ratified? What are your thoughts on the deal?
Okay, I was waiting for it, but you didn't use the A word.
No.
I'll use it.
Yeah.
So first of all, Trump's deal that was worked on for a long time. I still worked at the American Embassy back when it was officially in Tel Aviv. Now it's just practically in Tel Aviv. No one moved, by the way, to Jerusalem. Just a sign moved, and the ambassador has an office there. But that's not the topic. So the deal that was worked on for a long time, if you remember, the day that Trump presented it, he had Netanyahu with him on the big event, but the same day he also met with Gantz. And both of them completely went back to Israel and said, we take the deal almost as is. And that was before the elections. And then that means that both of them support it. Now, the deal, I'll mention very quickly some of the important bits of it. It says that Israel can annex or applied sovereignty, as the official term goes, over 30% of the West Bank. Not a single settlement will be evacuated, which is completely different than previous deals suggested. Some Palestinian cities in Israel will be passed on to the West Bank, like al-Fahim, for example, which is a very big Palestinian city that just happens to be a tiny bit west of the Green Line. And then the Gaza Strip will get 20% extra agricultural area in the Negev, where Israel and the US will help train the Palestinians for agriculture. And there would be a connection between, a connection made either through a tunnel or railway or something like that between the West Bank and Gaza. Jerusalem will remain as Israel's united capital, and the outskirts of Jerusalem will be recognized as the Palestinian capital. So the Palestinians can also say that Jerusalem is the capital, just like they demand. And it also includes $50 billion of aid to the Palestinian Authority. And it says that the refugees, which is the people who lived in what's now Israel in 48, will not be able to go back to the home, but they will be heavily compensated for it. That's the deal. I personally think, far from being perfect, calling it peace is far from being accurate, but not a bad basis. Nothing else works for the last 53 years. We might as well try something new. That's my position, a good basis for a new negotiation. In Israel, what Netanyahu and Gantz decided to do is, in the coalition agreement between them, they've mentioned that as early as July 1st, they can promote this topic and bring it to legislation of annexation of 30% of the West Bank, promote it, bring it to the approval of the Knesset and the government, and then basically apply Israeli sovereignty or annex, it's the same thing, different words, and those areas. What everyone disregards is the other half. What the US said is that you can do that in exchange to recognizing a Palestinian state. Now, on the last couple of days, we've been hearing Netanyahu went to meetings with the leaders of the settlers, and they said, over our dead body, we don't need your annexation, don't give us a Palestinian state. And you hear Lieberman and Bennett, for example, from the opposition, who say, we love the idea of annexation, not if it comes with a Palestinian state. That won't happen in our shift. So that's a big question. Basically, it's like, I will tell a kid, if you do your homework, you can go play with your friends. And the kid will come to me and say, yeah, I want to go play with friends. And I'll ask, what about the homework? And he'll like, I don't know. That's exactly it. The annexation is just like one bit of a much larger plan. And what we've been hearing in news recently is that senior officials in the US, when I was in the embassy, almost always meant the ambassador, say to the Israeli government, hold your horses, we have enough on our plate at the moment in order to start dealing with your annexation. The big question is what happens next, because despite the fact that Joe Biden said that if he wins, the embassy will stay in Jerusalem, again, the embassy is not in Jerusalem. The embassy is planned to actually move to Jerusalem in 7 to 10 years. But officially, the embassy will stay in Jerusalem. he said that he will not support Trump's plan, which means that Israel is in a rush. We have, what is it, like 4 months until the US elections, for Israel to complete anything that has to do with Trump's deal. Otherwise, it might never happen. Or Trump will win, and then everyone knows that the beginning of the second term is when US presidents do big stuff.
Yeah, because there's no opportunity to win another election.
Yeah. So I personally think, and I said it in every meeting I attend, don't rule out the plan only because Trump suggested it and because Bibi likes it. Look deeper into it, and you'll see it's a good basis for negotiation. The Palestinians, by the way, haven't ruled out the plan officially. They're completely against unilateral annexation, but they've never said no officially to the plan. And that's important to mention. Just last word about if Israel annexes parts of the West Bank, I hear many people in the community here saying we shouldn't discuss it yet because we have time and it will take time anyway. Remember what we've learned from history. The Golan Heights were annexed to Israel by legislation in the Knesset in 1980 by Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin has almost never discussed this topic publicly. One morning, he brought to the Knesset a bill to annex the Golan Heights. The next evening, it was a done deal. Don't hold your breath on like, we'll have a lot of time to discuss it, now it's premature. No. Now is the time to discuss it because those things can happen very, very quickly.
Yeah, so currently it is 8:37. We're going to do one last question, which will be from me, and we're going to stop at 8:40. But I will say, so Sefi, I've been to a few of your talks, and I will say you are somewhat of a political psychic when it comes to what you think the future will hold in terms of Labour and what's happened in terms of a unity government has been discussed by you as well. I just want to ask, is there, let's go with 5 predictions for the next term. Let's go till the end of the year, or we can go the end till like the next election. Are the 5 predictions you have to the next election?
Tough one. By the way, we didn't discuss any of the questions.
No.
Now you're really putting me on the spot.
Yeah.
One prediction that I have is that this government will succeed much more than people think. We see a lot of criticism, very public, with like ministers from the Likud who on camera criticize ministers from Blue and White, which almost never happened in Israel's history. And I think that this government has all the potential to fully go to the rest of the term and not to fail in the middle. I don't know if it's a prediction that they will succeed, but they have the potential to do that. I also believe, I can tell you more long term, I believe that there would be either a revolution in the Israeli Zionist left, or there would be no Israeli Zionist left, almost entirely. And many people like Yair Golan, for example, speak about completely demolishing it and rebuilding. So I think it's a longer term. You'll need like 3 years to judge me on that. But I believe that that's what will happen. I believe that we'll see a huge shift, although it might be quiet in the relations between Arabs and Jews in Israel. It doesn't necessarily mean that the actual people on both sides will like each other more. But we started seeing it with the coronavirus, how the Arabs became an integral part of the Israeli society, from pharmacists to doctors to anything you can imagine. And we could see how the Arab authorities accepted the police, accepted even the army came to help in Nazareth and other Arab cities, and the Arabs weren't against it at all. So I believe that we'll see much more collaboration between the government and the Arabs in Israel. That's free, right?
Yeah.
I believe that we'll see a lot of big headlines on Netanyahu's case. I'll be blown off my feet if he won't be convicted. It will take, again, 3 years or something. But there are 3 very strong cases against him. Even if 1 or 2 of them will fail, still a conviction, a minor conviction in one of them is supposed to send him to jail for over a year. So I believe that that would happen. And unfortunately, I also believe that we'll see the fractions in the Israeli society grow much larger than they are at the moment. Because if Israel used to be a model of how you can have a good political debate, very, very heated, but still stays okay, it's not the case recently. And a major journalist in Israel has recently deleted a post he wrote criticizing Netanyahu after amazing threats were made against him. 2 days ago, they arrested a 21-year-old from somewhere in the north, they didn't say where, because he threatened to kill Netanyahu. You see Netanyahu's son, what he says and what people say about him. Both sides are terrible. And it doesn't look like anyone says anything. You see the Attorney General has 24/7 security on him. It never happened in the history of Israel. When Netanyahu is asked what his opinion about it, he says, he genuinely said it. He said, "Why do you talk about him? Look at how people threaten my son." Instead of going and saying, threatening the Attorney General shouldn't happen. So I'm afraid that, I'm really afraid that we'll see some physical violence, but I'm just as afraid that we'll see the fractions in the Israeli society grow bigger and bigger, and I don't know if we'll ever be able to go back to the way the society looked like. In Australia, you can be a capital N liberal or a Labour supporter or a Green supporter, and you can argue and you can say even that the other side is completely ridiculous, but it will never escalate to what happens in Israel at the moment. So I had to finish with this negative. I'll go back to the positive. The positive is that I think that we'll see the government lasting, and I think that we'll see the Arab society cooperating with the government in a much larger scale, and we'll see Arabs taking a much larger role in the Israeli society.
All righty. Well, thank you both for that. It was definitely an enlightening discussion. Lots of questions asked and lots of questions answered. So big thank you to Sefi for taking the time to share his amazing knowledge. Big thank you to Ben for hosting the discussion. We've got some amazing events that are going to be coming up over the next month/2 months. So make sure you stay tuned to our Facebook page and our website for updates on that. And as always, thank you to our generous supporters for their continued support. Without them, things like this wouldn't be possible. So stay tuned to our social media, and thank you everyone for tuning in.
Thanks everyone.
Cheers.
Thanks, Joy.
Thank you.